After an accident happens, an investigation almost always reveals that the accident could have been avoided. A change in equipment might have made a job easier or safer to perform. Or a change in procedures might have eliminated the chance of human error. If the hazards had been identified in advance, an injury, or an illness, or environmental damage could have been prevented. A job hazard analysis, or JHA, is designed to do exactly that. In a JHA, each individual step in a job is examined. All of the hazards associated with each step are identified, and then recommendations are developed to eliminate or control each hazard. The result is a standardized procedure for performing a job in the safest and healthiest way possible. This process is often referred to as a job safety analysis, or JSA. However, it's important to remember that avoiding injuries is only part of the aim of the analysis. Employee health and environmental protection are just as important as safety, so job hazard analysis is really a more accurate term. Now, performing a JHA should always be a team effort. Even an apparently uncomplicated job can present more hazards than you might suspect. The more people involved in analyzing a job, the less likely it is that any hazards will be overlooked. When jobs are very complex, involving many steps and a wide variety of hazards, or when the hazards are difficult to recognize, the JHA team may need to include specialists, like an occupational hygienist or an ergonomist. Whatever the case, the JHA has got to be thorough. It must uncover every hazard associated with that job. Your role in the JHA process can vary. In some cases, you may be a member of a team performing a JHA, or you may be reviewing one done by a group of employees. In either case, you need to know how JHAs are performed and how to get maximum use out of the information they provide. Now, eventually, every job you supervise needs to undergo a hazard analysis. Your goal should be to have JHAs on file for every job you supervise, even those you consider to be the safest and most routine. When you have more than one job to analyze, choosing which ones to do first is an important decision. It will often depend on company policy. However, there are standard guidelines you can follow. It's best to deal with jobs that have already produced accidents or incidents. Start with the ones that have had the highest frequency of accidents or incidents, regardless of how serious those accidents were. Then analyze jobs that have produced any fatalities or disabling injuries or illness. If someone has already been hurt, there's a good chance a similar injury or illness will occur unless whatever caused it is either eliminated or controlled. Jobs which have the potential for causing serious injury or harm should be your next priority, even if no one has ever been hurt during the job. The potential alone is enough to qualify it for a JHA as soon as possible. Whenever new jobs are introduced in your area, a thorough JHA should be performed before any employee is assigned to it. The same is true for any jobs which involve changes in equipment, materials, or procedures, and any jobs affected by new regulations or standards. All right, let's take a look at a fairly straightforward job: refueling a liquid propane fork truck. It provides a good illustration of how a job hazard analysis is performed. As we said earlier, a JHA is a team effort. Normally, the team should include the most experienced operator, the person who is most familiar with the job procedures. Other employees who perform the job are included to serve as a check and balance, and to assure that no steps are omitted or performed out of sequence. Generally, a JHA form includes 3 columns, one for each part of the process. The first column is where the basic job steps are listed. Now, people sometimes have a problem deciding just what a job step is. Either they break the job down into too much detail, or they aren't detailed enough. The way to break the job down into specific steps is to watch the operator perform the entire job at least once to get an overview of what the job involves. Then, have the operator demonstrate the job slowly. As he does, list as job steps those tasks or actions that you would include if you were training someone to perform the job. Record the steps in the order they're done and use simple action phrases. Keep your description of each step short and to the point. In this case, the job can be divided into 8 individual steps. Park the vehicle at the fueling station. Disembark from the fork truck. Clear the fuel line. Disconnect the tank line. Remove the tank. Fill the tank. Reinstall the filled tank. Depart the fueling area. Don't start looking for hazards until you're sure you have every required step listed in the first column. Moving across columns before you've finished breaking the job down could cause you to overlook a step. When the team is certain that you've listed all the steps necessary to perform the job in the right order, you're ready to begin the next part of the JHA, identifying all hazards that are associated with each step. This part of the process involves asking a lot of questions aimed at determining all of the ways in which someone could get hurt or sick or possibly damage the environment. What you have to do is think about and discuss how each step is performed and look for anything that might reasonably go wrong during the normal performance of that step. Even if measures are already in place to control a hazard, identify the hazard anyway. You want those control measures to remain a part of the standard operating procedure for that job. For example, the first step requires the fork truck operator to park near the pump. Now, what possible hazards might be involved with parking the vehicle? Well, anytime a fork truck is parked, there's a possibility of unexpected movement. And when the engine must be left running, the chances of the truck moving are even greater. List each of the hazards you identify in the center column of your JHA form. Since some steps may have more than one hazard associated with them, number each one to correspond to the job step it applies to. Follow the same procedure for each job step and be thorough. You may need the operator to repeat certain steps so you can examine them more closely. It's important that people suggest any hazards that might occur to them. That way, you won't miss any. For example, for step 7, reinstall the filled tank, 5 hazards are identified. Without all of the team members trying to cover every possibility, some might have been overlooked. After you're satisfied that you have identified all of the hazard possibilities for each step, you're ready to make recommendations for eliminating or controlling each of those hazards. It's best to work on those recommendations right there at the job site. Staying in the actual work environment will let you check out the feasibility of any change that is suggested. You might discover that it would cause other problems. Working your possible recommendations through can help you come up with an even better solution. Your first objective should always be to eliminate the hazard whenever you can. If that's not feasible, you should recommend methods for controlling the hazard and minimizing the possibility that it will ever cause harm. The recommendations for step number 6 illustrate both approaches. The object of providing pre-filled tanks is to completely eliminate any possibility that the fork truck operator can be injured while refilling a tank. All the other recommendations are an effort to control hazards. Inspecting the equipment before use and following safe procedures during the filling operation minimize the chances of a leak or a fire. Recommending the use of the proper gloves in step 4 is another example of controlling a hazard. Personal protective equipment is often the only alternative when a particular hazard cannot be eliminated. And recommendation 6A2 is a good example of controlling a possible procedural error. Preventing a gas leak depends on the operator making a tight connection at the fuel tank. Calling his attention to the importance of that connection with a warning sign will help reduce the possibility of a fire. As you continue down the list of hazards, remember to make at least one recommendation for each hazard you've identified. If a control measure is already in place for a hazard, list that control measure anyway. One purpose of a JHA is to point out changes in a job that will make it safer and healthier. But it has other uses as well, and they require a comprehensive list of all hazards and all hazard controls. A JHA can provide the basis for creating or improving a standard operating procedure for the job. Because it lists all of the job steps in sequence, it can be used as a starting point for a more detailed description of how a job should be performed. The hazards listed and the recommendations for controlling them are used to develop the safest and healthiest procedures possible. A JHA also provides an excellent guide for training employees who will be performing the job. It allows you to go over the job step by step, point out every hazard, and emphasize any parts of the operation that require special attention. JHAs can be very useful in other ways as well. When you observe employees performing a job to be certain they're doing it safely, use the JHA to help you focus on those steps that involve critical health, safety, or environmental precautions. If you conduct your own inspections, you want to be sure they are thorough. A JHA can help you identify particular conditions or locations that must be included during an inspection. And in the event of an accident, a JHA can provide a valuable investigation tool. Comparing the procedures which led up to the accident with those outlined in the JHA will help you determine if the job was being performed correctly or if a hazard was missed in the initial analysis. Now, to come up with a JHA that is as complete and accurate as possible, you have to do a good job of recognizing potential hazards. That means you have to ask a lot of questions, and they have to be the right ones. There are some useful guidelines you can follow to make sure you ask all the questions you need to. First of all, remember that you're looking for any hazard that could cause either an injury, an illness, or environmental harm. Not every job will present hazards that apply to all three of these categories. It's important to keep all three possibilities in mind whenever you're examining a job step. You also have to recognize that certain job tasks or conditions or materials are always going to present the potential for harm. For instance, whenever a job step requires lifting or moving objects, there's always a potential for illness or an injury to the back or some other part of the body. You need to ask questions like, does the employee have to handle heavy objects? Does the employee have to reach or twist? How often is lifting required? Whenever chemicals are involved in a job, depending upon the substance, hazards that threaten health, safety, and the environment can all be likely. If you find that hazardous substances are part of the job, there are some questions you have to ask. For example, during any job step, is there any way an employee might be exposed to hazardous material? Is there a potential for fire or explosion? Could any part of the job cause a release of a hazardous material to the environment? And any time a job requires an employee to operate or work near machinery, there are always hazards you have to consider. Is there any way for the employee to be caught in, on, or by any part of the machine? Are all of the moving parts guarded? The point is that team members between them have to have a certain amount of knowledge about the kinds of hazards a job is likely to present. To some extent, you have to know what you're looking for and have questions already prepared. But they are only a guide, a beginning point. You have to examine the specific situation you're looking at. Don't let any prepared questions blind you to hazards that are unique to the particular job. To make your JHA thorough, ask the operators about any possibilities. Are there any hazardous shortcuts an employee might be tempted to take? Is there any way to get around protective devices? Often, a JHA team will include another level of questions to help identify hazards that might be created if job steps are not performed correctly or if normal operating conditions change. Including these what-if situations as part of a JHA can identify additional control measures that may need to be implemented. For example, what if power is momentarily interrupted? Can the sudden restart of the equipment create a hazard? Are there any recommended procedures that need to be followed? Or when a job requires fluids to be kept within a specific temperature range. Are there any health, safety, or environmental hazards that might occur if those fluids freeze or overheat? Dealing with what-if questions can be tricky. The team can either spend time on possibilities that are extremely unlikely, or they might miss a possibility that is important. Here again, the team needs to rely on the operators for a guideline. All right. One last thing about doing a JHA. When you are making recommendations, explore as many alternative ways for dealing with each hazard as possible. When a hazard can be eliminated or controlled in several ways, each recommendation should be listed. There are a couple of reasons for this. In some cases, the control measures will take time to implement, and temporary measures might have to be put into place in the meantime. For instance, the best solution might be an equipment or workstation modification. But until that can be completed, a temporary control measure like personal protective equipment might have to be used. And sometimes the best or most feasible way to eliminate a hazard might have to be determined from a larger perspective. For example, your JHA might be part of a process safety review. In that case, final decisions about control measures can be made only after information concerning other aspects of the overall operation have been reviewed. If your JHA includes alternatives, you'll be providing as much information as possible to the people conducting the process review. Now, as you can see, performing a job hazard analysis on the jobs in your work area is important. A JHA provides the information you need to eliminate or control the hazards associated with a job. And it provides the basis for establishing standardized operating procedures to ensure that employees know how to perform the job in the healthiest and safest way possible. Done correctly, JHAs are a vital part of preventing accidents, illnesses, and environmental damage.